A stillness fell over the sky, long before anyone realized something was wrong. Engines' whispered lights dimmed, and time itself seemed to hold its breath. What followed wasn't luck or miracle. It was a moment when innocence met instinct at 33,000 feet. Stay through to the end, like this video, subscribe, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Flight 447 rose from the runway like a silver arrow under a soft Pacific haze, climbing smoothly toward 33,000 feet. The engines purred in rhythm. The sky stretched wide and calm, and every seatbelt sign clicked off in unison. Passengers settled into their routines, some reading, some sleeping, some scrolling through their phones without a care. But in seat 14, by the left window of the mid-cabin sat 12-year-old Malachi Brooks, a quiet black boy traveling alone for the first time since his father's funeral. His hands rested neatly on his lap, his eyes calm yet alert. Unlike most kids his age, Malachi didn't squirm or chat or kick the seat ahead. He simply stared through the glass, following the wing's tip as it carved through the thin blue above the clouds. The flight attendants found him polite, maybe even old-fashioned, with a respectful "yes, ma'am" for every offer, and a small, steady smile. What they couldn't see was that beneath that calm exterior was a boy raised in the shadow of flight, a boy who'd spent half his childhood sitting beside a man who once commanded the skies. His father, Captain Vernon Brooks, had been a commercial pilot for nearly 2 decades before a sudden stroke ended his flying career and left him partially paralyzed. Confined to a wheelchair, Vernon had turned their modest living room into an improvised cockpit. Instead of bedtime stories, he'd given his son flight lessons. "Knowledge keeps you alive," he used to say. "You never waste it, even if you never need it." At first, Malachi's mother called it obsession, but after Vernon's death, those lessons became the boy's inheritance, the kind that couldn't be held, but could save a life. The plane leveled at cruise altitude. A calm announcement came through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our cruising altitude of 33,000 feet. Sit back, relax, and enjoy your flight." The passengers barely reacted, content to settle into their quiet bubble of normalcy. Malachi took out his small sketchbook and began drawing the curve of the horizon. The woman next to him smiled. "You're a good traveler," she said kindly. "Not many 12-year-olds sit so still." Malachi smiled back. "My dad taught me. He said airplanes don't like noise." The woman chuckled softly, thinking he was joking, but Malachi wasn't. He believed airplanes listened, and if you paid attention, they talked back through hums, clicks, and vibrations most people never noticed. A few rows up, Flight Attendant Clarice Henson rolled the drink cart down the aisle, her practiced smile bright against the dim cabin lights. "Apple or orange juice, sweetheart?" she asked when she reached him. "Apple, please," Malachi said softly. She poured the drink, glanced at his boarding pass, and nodded approvingly. "Traveling alone? That's brave." "Yes, ma'am. My aunt's meeting me at the gate." "Well, you let us know if you need anything, all right?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied again, polite as always. Clarice moved on, unaware that she had just spoken to the only person on the flight who would recognize what was about to happen before anyone else. 10 minutes later, the first flicker came, just a quick blink of the cabin lights. A few passengers looked up, then shrugged it off. Malachi didn't. He paused his sketch, looking at the overhead panels. A faint hum changed pitch for less than a second before returning to normal. He listened, frowning slightly. His father's words echoed in memory. "If the sky blinks, listen." A minute later, it happened again, longer this time. Clarice noticed too. She frowned, reached for the intercom phone near the galley, and pressed the button. No sound. She tried again. Nothing. Her lips parted as she whispered, "That's strange." The senior attendant, Marla, approached, her voice low. "Intercom down, completely dead," Clarice replied. "No cockpit response either." "Try again." Clarice obeyed, pressing the button harder, waiting. Still nothing. Marla forced a smile for the watching passengers. "Just a little static. We'll check it out." But her voice trembled slightly. betraying her calm. In seat 14I, Malachi closed his sketchbook. His breathing slowed. He had heard that tone in his father's stories, the tone that came before things went wrong. He glanced around. Everything looked normal, but the air felt heavier. Somehow the rhythm of the plane subtly off. The aircraft wasn't adjusting for turbulence, wasn't correcting its course like it normally did. It was flying perfectly level, unnaturally so. Malachi whispered to himself, autopilot only. The words chilled him. If both pilots were conscious, the flight path would have small fluctuations. Smooth flight wasn't always a good sign. It often meant machines were flying without human touch. Up in the cockpit, Captain James Morrison and First Officer Kelly Tran were indeed facing something beyond training. Static filled their headsets. "No radio," Morrison muttered. Backup frequency Tran switched channels, only static. She tried the transponder. It read offline. "How's that possible?" Morrison said, scanning the panels. All power indicators were green. Everything's functional except communications. The pilots exchanged uneasy glances. Morrison reached for the emergency frequency again, nothing but hissing silence. The electromagnetic interference, invisible and rare, crawled through the plane's circuits like a virus. Morrison rubbed his temple. "All right, procedure says maintain heading squawk 7,600. He entered the code, but the transponder stayed dark. "Dead," he whispered. Then, without warning, a surge jolted through the control panel. The cockpit filled with a sharp ozone smell. Both pilots gasped, blinking as their vision blurred. Within seconds, they were unconscious, slumped forward over the controls. The aircraft sealed the cockpit automatically, a safety protocol triggered by rapid decompression in the forward cabin. To the passengers, nothing changed. The engines purred, the altitude stayed constant, and the sky remained deceptively calm. Back in the cabin, Marla returned to Clarice. "Still nothing?" she asked. "Nothing," Clarice said. "Even the emergency channel's dead." Marla looked down the aisle. Passengers were starting to notice the tension. "Keep calm," she murmured. "We'll try again in a minute." Malachi watched her carefully. She was doing her best to stay composed, but her voice had the faint quiver of someone pretending not to panic. His father used to describe it as the silence before fear finds its name. Malachi Brooks sat perfectly still, eyes fixed on the curve of the wing, his reflection faint in the window glass. He could feel something changing, something intangible, like the difference between peace and pause. His father used to say that a plane was like a living thing. It had moods, it breathed, and if you paid attention, you could tell when something inside it had gone wrong. That voice, deep and calm, still echoed inside his head as if the man were sitting beside him, now explaining every detail of what was happening 33,000 feet above the earth. Captain Vernon Brooks had once been one of the best in his airline. People described him as meticulous, quiet, and methodical. The kind of man who trusted numbers more than instinct, yet always knew when to trust both. His career ended abruptly 2 years before, when a stroke paralyzed the right side of his body. He could no longer fly, but his mind remained sharp, and his obsession with the art of flight didn't fade. Stripped of the skies, he turned his home into a world of flight. In their small apartment near Sacramento, he lined the walls with aviation charts, radio manuals, and cockpit schematics. His wheelchair sat permanently before a large computer desk where multiple monitors displayed a professional-grade simulator, while other fathers taught their sons how to catch a baseball. Vernon taught his boy about wind shear altitude correction and transponder codes. "In the sky, hesitation kills," he often said. "Preparation saves." Malachi had listened carefully even when his mother, tired and exasperated, had begged him to go outside and play instead. But there was something hypnotic in the world his father showed him, a world of switches, lights, and sound that obeyed logic and discipline instead of emotion and chaos. On evenings when the pain in his father's arm was too great to hide, Malachi would take the controls of the simulator. He was small, then his feet barely touching the pedals, but his father guided him through every command. "Ailerons left," Vernon would say softly. "Throttle up 2%, compensate for crosswind." The boy's hands moved with surprising steadiness for his age. By the time he was 10, he could complete full takeoff and landing sequences without a single prompt. His father would smile quietly, not with pride, but with relief. "You have what I never had at 12, he told him once. Focus. The lessons never stopped, even at dinner. What's the code for communication failure? 7600. And if both pilots are down, assess engage autopilot, identify position, then descend manually. Good!" The questions became ritual, the knowledge embedded like reflexes. When Vernon died suddenly the following spring, those lessons didn't vanish. They sank deeper, like instinct, waiting for the day it would matter. Now, as the plane around him whispered its warnings in electric hums, Malachi understood that day had come. Clarice moved down the aisle again, trying to appear calm, but glancing often at the cockpit door. She picked up the intercom phone and pressed the button. Silence. She tried again, tapping it twice. Still nothing. Her lips tightened, and she whispered something to the senior attendant, who nodded stiffly and disappeared toward the front. Malachi's pulse quickened. He closed his eyes briefly, breathing slow, remembering his father's voice from years ago. "If everything goes quiet, and people don't notice you notice for them." The quiet deepened, stretching through the cabin like a shadow. A passenger coughed. A baby whimpered. A faint tremor rolled beneath the floor, subtle but wrong. The plane was maintaining altitude, but its rhythm had changed. Every few seconds, Malachi's fingers twitched, wanting to reach for instruments that weren't in front of him. His mind began replaying his father's drills. Communication failure, autopilot engagement, cabin intercom down, possible electrical interference. Each possibility lined up in his head like tiles falling into place. The more he thought, the clearer it became. The pilots were not responding. The attendants were losing contact, and the passengers didn't know yet that the entire flight was suspended in a fragile stillness, flying itself over a world oblivious to the danger above. Up front, Clarice reached the cockpit door and pressed the entry code. Nothing. She waited 10 seconds and tried again. Still nothing. Her training told her that if there was no response within 30 seconds, protocol required emergency access. But procedure also demanded silence and calm in front of passengers. She pressed her forehead lightly against the door, listening. Nothing. She turned her face pale and met the eyes of Marla. No response, she mouthed. Marla hesitated, then nodded grimly. "We give them another minute," she said. But both women already knew something inside that door had gone terribly wrong. In seat 14, Malachi saw the shift in their posture. He recognized it instantly, the barely contained panic of people trying to appear in control. He thought about what his father had once told him about fear. The worst kind of fear, Vernon had said, is the one you can't name out loud. It builds in silence until it commands the room. The plane had reached that silence now. No one screamed. No one knew enough to. But every second that passed, the danger grew louder inside Malachi's mind. He remembered one evening 2 years earlier when his father had shown him a real cockpit on a maintenance visit. The smell of jet fuel and cold steel lingered in the air. One day his father had said, "If the sky ever goes wrong, you'll know before anyone else does. You'll feel it." Back then, Malachi had laughed. "What would I even do, Dad? You'd do what I taught you. You'd take control." The boy had thought it was only pride talking. Now that memory burned in his chest like a warning. The hum in the cabin deepened into a low, strange vibration. Some passengers noticed now. A man across the aisle asked, "Is that normal?" Clarice smiled too quickly. "Just a system recalibration," she said. But when she walked away, her hands trembled. Malachi turned toward the window. The wing lights flickered faintly, a sign of an electrical surge passing through the circuits. He exhaled slowly. He could almost hear his father again. When lights dance like that, power's fighting itself. The woman beside him shifted uneasily. "Everything all right, honey?" "Yes, ma'am," Malachi said. But his tone carried a certainty she didn't understand. He had been prepared for moments like this, drilled into awareness by a man who refused to believe that knowledge could ever be wasted. For a boy so young, his calm wasn't natural, it was trained. He was the product of a father's obsession turned legacy, a child built out of discipline and duty. He looked forward again, his mind aligning data the way a pilot reads weather, the silence, the flicker, the tension in the crew, the lack of radio contact. Every piece fit a pattern, and the pattern pointed toward one truth. The pilots weren't flying the plane anymore. In the front of the cabin, Clarice took a deep breath and turned to Marla. "We're going in?" she whispered. Marla nodded, unlocking the small panel by the door and inserting the emergency override key. The mechanical whir was faint but distinct. The door clicked. The moment it swung open, both women froze. Inside, both pilots were slumped forward motionless, their oxygen masks dangling uselessly from above. The instrument panels glowed normally. Autopilot engaged, all systems green, but the men meant to control them were gone. Clarice covered her mouth, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. Marla whispered, "Oh my God." For a long second, the two women just stared. Then training took over. Clarice reached for the nearest mask, placed it over Captain Morrison's face, then over First Officer Tran's. Nothing changed. Both were alive but unconscious. Clarice stepped backward, trembling. "We need help," she said. "Now." The passengers still didn't know that both pilots lay motionless behind a sealed door, but they could feel something was wrong, even if they couldn't name it. The engines hummed like distant thunder, too steady too, even like a heart that had forgotten how to beat irregularly. At 33,000 feet, the aircraft was a sealed tube of confusion gliding through an invisible storm. The electromagnetic wave from a solar flare, triggered hours earlier by a burst of radiation from the sun, had reached Earth's atmosphere and was now crawling across its upper airspace, interfering with every radio frequency within miles. Every link between Flight 447 and the ground had been erased in an instant. In the cockpit, the panels still glowed calmly, the autopilot held the course perfectly, and the world outside remained deceptively tranquil. But there were no signals leaving or entering that metal shell. Clarice Henson stood frozen near the galley, her pulse racing in her throat. The moment she had opened the cockpit door and seen both pilots slumped forward, she had known the situation had crossed from problem to crisis. She had done everything her training told her: check breathing use, oxygen, confirm heartbeats, but neither man had stirred. The autopilot was still engaged, which kept the plane steady, but without communication, they were flying blind. Now standing there under the flickering cabin light, she looked down the aisle, trying to decide how much truth to tell. Panic spread faster than fire in enclosed air, and once it began, it couldn't be stopped. She smoothed her uniform, swallowed hard, and began walking towards the passengers. She didn't know that one boy in row 14 already understood everything without a single word being said. Malachi Brooks sat upright now, no longer pretending to be calm. His mind was a storm of calculations and recall, flipping through every emergency scenario his father had ever drilled into him. Electrical failure, radio loss, autopilot override, dead communication. He could almost hear his father's low voice, as if the man were right beside him, whispering through the static. If they stop talking, start thinking. Don't wait for permission to act. Malachi had been raised on procedure, trained to treat logic like air. Even now, as fear pressed down on him, his thoughts were methodical. The flickering lights weren't just coincidence. The subtle hum beneath the floor wasn't harmless. Something had shut down communication completely, and if the crew couldn't talk to the cockpit, it meant the cockpit was no longer responding. He replayed the timeline in his head first. The flicker, then the static, then the silence. He knew enough about aircraft systems to know that power failures were rarely isolated. Whatever had hit the radios had likely struck every transmitting circuit simultaneously. That wasn't a malfunction. That was interference. Clarice reached the front of the cabin again, whispering to the lead attendant, Marla, who was pale and trembling. "They're alive," Clarice said in a low voice, "but they're unresponsive. The autopilot's still holding." Marla's voice cracked. "How long will that last?" "Until we run out of fuel," Clarice answered. The words hung between them like smoke. For a second, neither woman spoke. Then Marla said quietly, "We have to tell them something." Clarice nodded. She turned toward the passengers, her voice rising just enough to carry over the low roar of the engines. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. We are experiencing a technical issue with communication systems. Please remain seated and calm while we work to restore contact with air traffic control. The lie was necessary, but her voice wavered slightly, betraying the truth she didn't dare speak. The passengers murmured among themselves. Some looked nervous, others barely reacted. They trusted procedure, believed in professionalism, assumed the people in charge always knew what to do. Only one person in that cabin knew the gravity of what those words meant. Malachi's pulse quickened. He could tell by her phrasing that the situation was far worse than she admitted. Technical issue in airline language was code for something we can't fix yet. He thought about the checklist his father had made him memorize for communication loss. Step 1, confirm autopilot. Step 2, attempt manual frequency. Step 3, declare emergency visually if unable to transmit. None of those steps could be taken from the passenger cabin. He glanced toward the front, seeing Clarice whispering urgently with the other attendants again. His throat felt dry. He wanted to stand up to tell her what he knew, but part of him hesitated. He was just a boy. Nobody would believe him. Meanwhile, outside the aircraft, the world below went dark. Ground control lost contact with flight 447 23 minutes earlier. At first, they assumed a signal drop, a simple radio glitch, but as radar failed to pick up the transponder signal, concern turned to alarm. The flight had vanished from the system. Controllers attempted multiple emergency frequencies. Nothing. Other planes in nearby airspace were asked to hail them. Still nothing. Somewhere over Oregon's upper atmosphere, the aircraft had entered a kind of electronic ghost zone. To the world, Flight 447 no longer existed. Back in the cabin, the mood began to shift. The longer the silence stretched, the more eyes lifted from phones and magazines. People started noticing the attendants whispering the lack of cockpit announcements, the subtle tremor in the flight pattern that wasn't there before. The calm facade was cracking. Marla finally gave a nod to Clarice, signaling her to take the next step. Clarice took a deep breath, then moved forward again, her voice now more direct. Ladies and gentlemen, if there is anyone aboard with flight experience, please make yourself known to the crew. The question struck the cabin like thunder. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. A few heads turned. A man in business class half rose, then sank back. The silence that followed was unbearable. No one moved. No one spoke. The implication settled in. Like cold air, they were in the sky with no one capable of flying the plane. Malachi's heart pounded. He had known this moment might come since he was 10 years old, though he had never believed it would actually happen. He looked around at the frightened faces, at the frozen stillness of adults who had no idea what to do. His father's voice returned one more time in memory. If you ever know what others don't, you don't wait, you act. Malachi's hand trembled on the armrest. His rational mind screamed for caution, but the other part of him, the trained part, was already forming a plan. He could read the instruments. He knew how autopilot worked. He could help if they would only listen. But to stand up now to announce that a 12-year-old boy understood more about flight systems than anyone else on board seemed impossible. Still, the longer he waited, the greater the risk. Every second counted. Clarice looked around the cabin again, desperate. Is there anyone at all a pilot, a co-pilot, even private training? Her voice cracked mid-sentence. A baby started crying. Someone prayed aloud. The plane hummed along, indifferent. That was when Malachi unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice almost lost in the noise. "I think I can help." She didn't hear him the first time. He spoke louder, firmer. "Ma'am, I think I can help." Several passengers turned toward him, frowning. A man 2 rows up chuckled nervously. "Sit down, kid. This isn't the time to play hero." Malachi didn't move. His expression was calm, steady. "I'm not playing, sir." Clarice finally noticed him. Their eyes met. Something in his look, focused, fearless, made her pause. "What's your name?" she asked. "Malachi Brooks," he said. "My father was Captain Vernon Brooks. He trained me." For a long second, she just stared. The words shouldn't have made sense, but the confidence behind them did. Something in her gut told her this wasn't fantasy. This was someone who had been waiting his whole life for a moment like this, and that terrified her more than anything. Marla appeared beside her, whispering quickly, "Clarice, we need to act. The cockpit is sealed, and we can't keep the passengers calm for long." Clarice nodded stiffly. Her fingers hovered over the keypad beside the reinforced door. The emergency override could open it, but protocol demanded that they wait at least 3 failed attempts at normal access before trying. They had already waited too long. The plane had been silent for over 20 minutes. The hum of the engines filled every gap between their words. Behind her, passengers were beginning to murmur louder, the calm unraveling thread by thread. She keyed in the access code once more. The keypad light turned red. She tried again. Red again. Marla pressed her palm against the cool metal, whispering, "Captain Morrison, do you copy?" Silence answered her. The plane remained indifferent. Malachi Brooks sat watching from his seat, gripping his small backpack as if it were the only anchor he had. The whispers had spread now, rumors of pilots asleep, of hijacks, of malfunctions, but he knew better. He watched Clarice's body language, the tension in her shoulders, the tightness in her jaw. She wasn't dealing with a radio issue anymore. She was facing absence. His father had once explained to him how a cockpit door could become both protection and prison. After 2001, Vernon Brooks had said they built those doors like vaults. Nobody gets in without permission, even if the people inside are dying. Malachi remembered the tone in his father's voice, half pride, half warning. Now he understood the full weight of those words. The same door that was meant to protect them was now trapping their only pilots inside. He unbuckled his seatbelt, quietly sliding into the aisle, as passengers argued in soft panic. A man in a business suit muttered, "They'd tell us if something was wrong." Another replied, "Would they look around you?" The unease spread like a ripple. Clarice turned back toward them and forced a tight smile. "Please remain seated, everyone. The crew is assessing the situation. There's no cause for alarm." Her voice wavered on the last word. She looked back at Marla. "We're going in," she said, finally pulling the small metal key from the emergency compartment. "Ready?" Marla nodded. Clarice inserted it into the panel. The lock released with a mechanical click. She hesitated, glancing at the passengers. "Stay calm," she said again, though her voice carried fear now. She pushed the door open. Inside, the dim light from the instrument panels reflected off the pilots' faces, pale and motionless. Captain Morrison was slumped forward, his chin against his chest oxygen mask, loose and dangling. First Officer Tran leaned sideways, her head resting against the console, eyes closed. The displays still glowed with steady green lights, altitude 33,000 heading stable. Every system looked perfect. But the humans behind them were gone. Clarice's knees nearly buckled. She whispered, "Oh my God." Marla stepped closer, shaking. "Check their pulses." Clarice moved to Morrison, pressing her fingers against his neck. There was a heartbeat, faint but present. She moved to Tran, did the same, alive but unresponsive. She turned back to Marla. "They're breathing, but they're not conscious." Marla looked at the instruments, blinking at the steady readings. "How can everything be green?" she asked. Clarice shook her head slowly. "Because machines don't panic. People do." She reached for the intercom to make an announcement, but remembered too late that it was dead. She stepped into the doorway, looking down the aisle. 160 passengers, restless now, waiting for reassurance she didn't have. She would have to tell them face to face. As she walked towards the front of the cabin, her hands trembled. The noise of whispers rose around her. A woman clutched her child. A man stood up, demanding answers. Clarice raised her voice above them. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, I need your attention." The cabin fell gradually quiet, the fear almost physical now. "We're experiencing a technical emergency," she said carefully. "Both our pilots are currently unable to operate the aircraft." Gasps erupted instantly. However, she continued quickly, "The autopilot is maintaining stable flight, and all systems are functioning. There is no immediate danger." The contradiction of her words, pilots down, but no danger hung heavily in the air. Malachi stood near his seat, his heart racing. He watched the crowd break into chaos. Some people shouted questions. Others began praying. The woman beside his seat whispered, "Dear God, we're going to die." Malachi turned toward the front where Clarice stood trembling. He knew what came next. His father's voice filled his mind again, as clear as if the man were in the aisle beside him. "If you ever know what to do when no one else does, you don't wait to be asked. You step forward." He took a deep breath and began walking up the aisle. "Excuse me," he said softly. No one heard. He spoke louder. "Excuse me, ma'am." Clarice turned startled. "Please sit down," she said quickly, her voice cracking. "It's not safe to move around." "I can help," Malachi said, firm but respectful. She blinked at him. "Sweetheart, please sit." "I can help," he repeated. "My father was Captain Vernon Brooks. He taught me flight systems, emergency procedures, and manual navigation. You need someone who understands what's happening up there." "I do." For a long second, Clarice just stared at him, unable to process what he'd said. The passengers nearby began murmuring again. Someone laughed nervously. "The kid thinks he's a pilot," a man said, shaking his head. But Malachi didn't flinch. He met Clarice's eyes, his gaze steady, trained older than his years. "You need someone to read those instruments," he said quietly. "I can do that." Clarice hesitated. She wanted to dismiss him, to call for anyone else, but no one had come forward. And deep down, she recognized that tone. It wasn't childish confidence, it was certainty. "What's your name again?" she asked finally. "Malachi Brooks," he replied. "And you've done this before?" "Only in simulators," he admitted, "but the systems are the same. I can help you understand what we're seeing." Marla leaned in, whispering, "Clarice, this is insane. We can't bring a child into the cockpit." Clarice whispered back, "And we can't fly this thing ourselves." For a moment they just stood there, surrounded by the murmurs of a plane full of frightened strangers, the air charged with disbelief. Then Clarice made a choice. "All right, Malachi," she said softly. "Come with me." Gasps followed as the boy began walking toward the cockpit beside the attendants. Some passengers reached out to stop him, others watched in stunned silence. As he reached the door, he glanced back, once his eyes scanning the cabin full of fear and doubt. He wasn't sure if he could save anyone, but he knew he had to try. Inside the cockpit, the light was colder, more sterile. The air smelled faintly of ozone and metal. Malachi stepped inside, his small hands trembling only slightly as he approached the panels. His eyes moved rapidly over the displays. Everything read normal altitude 33,000, airspeed 478 knots, fuel steady. The autopilot symbol glowed green. It looked perfect, but it wasn't. He understood why the attendants hadn't known what to do. Everything about the plane said fine, except the fact that no human being was flying it. He moved closer, whispering almost to himself. "It's in cruise hold. It'll stay like this until the fuel runs out." Clarice's eyes widened. "How long is that, too?" "Maybe 3 hours," Malachi said softly. "Then it'll fall." Some said the pilots were dead, others that the plane had been hacked, and still others that this was just turbulence and would soon pass. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. Something was very wrong, and no one was in control. Clarice Henson stood near the cockpit door, trying to keep her posture steady, her uniform still immaculate despite the tremor in her hands. She had done the impossible, trusted a 12-year-old boy to step into the cockpit, and now she faced the impossible again, convincing 160 adults that it was their best chance to survive. Malachi Brooks sat in the co-pilot's seat, small, and focused, his hands resting just above the console, as if afraid to touch it too soon. His dark eyes flicked across the glowing panels, reading numbers and symbols the way other kids read comic books. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be in middle school, not 33,000 feet in the air, trying to save lives. But when Clarice had turned to him and said, "Then the boy flies," there had been no hesitation left in him. His father's voice lived in every instinct he had. When the world panics, Vernon Brooks had said, "Once you become the calm it needs." Now he could feel that calm like a thread running through his pulse. Clarice stood behind him, eyes wide with uncertainty, while Marla kept watch on the cabin beyond the door, where the noise was rising again. The passengers were no longer whispering. They were shouting questions, demanding answers. "Who's flying the plane? What's happening up there? Are we going to crash?" Clarice turned back toward them, raising her voice over the noise. "Please stay seated. The situation is under control." The words were automatic, but the conviction wasn't there. A man in his 60s stood up in the middle of the aisle, tall and sharp-eyed, his voice cutting through the chaos. "I used to work for the FAA," he said firmly. "I was an air traffic controller for 25 years. Heads turned toward him, hope flashing briefly in terrified faces. "Then help them," someone shouted. The man nodded, gripping the seat in front of him for balance. "I can help with communication protocol, but I've never flown anything this size. I don't know the controls." The hope dimmed again. Clarice glanced at him, her expression torn between relief and despair. "Sir, we could use your help, but the controls are all manual. We need someone who can read them." Her gaze shifted toward the cockpit, toward the boy sitting so still in the co-pilot's chair. "We already have someone who can," she said softly. Malachi looked up from the instrument panel. "I can handle the systems," he said, voice steady, "but I'll need help reading altitude and speed while I work the trim." The former controller, whose name was Richard Hall, hesitated. "Kid, this isn't a simulator. Those controls aren't forgiving." Malachi didn't blink. "Neither is gravity." The older man stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right," he said. "Tell me what you need." Clarice motioned for him to step forward. As Hall entered the cockpit, he froze at the sight of the unconscious pilots, their limp bodies bathed in green instrument light. "They're alive," Clarice whispered, "but they're not waking up." Hall pressed his lips together and looked at the boy again. "You said you can read these panels." "Yes, sir," Malachi said. "My father was a captain. He trained me. I know what I'm looking at." The words carried such conviction that even Hall found himself believing. Malachi pointed at the displays. "We're holding altitude at 33,000 feet. Airspeed steady at 478 knots. Heading 340. All systems show green, but the communication suite is dead. We're not transmitting or receiving anything." Hall leaned closer, scanning the readouts. "You're right," he said quietly. "We're flying blind. Nobody knows we're up here." Malachi nodded. "That's why we need to navigate manually. If we can get visual contact with the ground, we can find a landing point." Clarice frowned. "But how do we even start that we descend?" Malachi replied simply. "Not fast, gradually. If we can get below the cloud line, we can see landmarks, highways, cities. Once we identify where we are, we can pick the closest airport." Marla stepped into the cockpit doorway, whispering urgently. "The passengers are panicking. They're saying a child's flying the plane." Clarice exhaled shakily. "Then tell them that child knows what he's doing." Her words hung in the air, fragile but real. Malachi adjusted his seat slightly, his feet barely touching the rudder pedals. "I'll need someone to monitor instruments while I fly," he said. "Mr. Hall, can you do that?" "I can call out readings," Hall replied. "Just tell me what you need first." Malachi looked over the console one last time, his small hands hovering above the controls. "We'll start with a slow descent," he said. "We need to drop altitude to 10,000 feet to see clearly. I'll disengage the autopilot and take manual control." Clarice's breath caught. "Are you sure?" "Yes, ma'am. Autopilot can't navigate around terrain or weather. If we don't see the ground soon, we'll lose our chance to land before the fuel runs out." He reached for the control yoke. His father's words echoed again. "The plane wants to fly. Don't fight it, guide it." He pressed the autopilot disconnect. A soft chime filled the cockpit, followed by a sudden, almost imperceptible shift in vibration. The plane responded immediately, its weight changing from mechanical steadiness to organic tension. The yoke felt heavy in his hands, but it wasn't unfamiliar. "Autopilot off," he said clearly. "Maintaining level flight." Hall nodded, watching the numbers. Altitude 32,900. Malachi adjusted the pitch slightly, pushing forward gently, descending 100 feet per minute, keeping it steady. Back in the cabin, the passengers felt the subtle shift. A few gasped. Others looked around nervously as the hum deepened. "What's happening?" Someone cried. Marla raised her hands. "The crew is adjusting altitude. Please remain calm." The reassurance didn't help much, but it bought them a few minutes. Clarice stayed near the door watching Malachi work. The boy's composure was unsettling in its perfection. His fingers moved over switches with practiced precision, his eyes never leaving the instruments. "You've done this before," Hall said quietly. "Only in simulations," Malachi answered. "But they don't lie. The math is the same." The plane continued its slow, controlled descent. The hum grew louder, more human somehow. Outside, the endless sky began to thicken with clouds, their edges glowing orange from the dying sun. The world looked both beautiful and dangerous. Malachi glanced through the window. "Once we break the lower cloud layer, we should see the ground," he said. Hall checked the gauges. Altitude 29,000. Descent steady. Airspeed 450. "Good," Malachi replied. "We'll hold that for another 2,000 feet, then adjust power." Clarice watched him silently, her disbelief giving way to awe. The boy wasn't just imitating his father's lessons, he was living them. A loud thump echoed from the back of the plane as luggage shifted from the slight pitch change. Several passengers screamed. Clarice's headset buzzed faintly, but still no communication signal. She steadied herself and called into the cabin. "Everything is fine, just an adjustment." The noise settled, but fear still buzzed through the air. In the cockpit, Hall looked at Malachi again. "You're calm," he said softly. Why, Malachi's voice was barely audible. "Because if I'm not, no one else will be." The descent continued. At 27,000 feet, the first glimpse of land appeared through breaks in the clouds, dark shapes of mountains and rivers fading beneath the haze. "There," Malachi said quietly. "We're over Oregon. That's Crater Lake." Hall leaned forward, astonished. "You're right. You just spotted it visually." "My father made me memorize landmarks on simulator routes," Malachi said. "From San Francisco to Portland, you pass Crater Lake about halfway." He turned the yoke, gently adjusting the heading. "We're on course." Clarice's eyes filled with tears she didn't understand. This child who had no right to be here was saving them. The hum of the engines was steady, deceptively calm, as the air outside began to shift from the gentle gold of evening to the bruised gray of approaching dusk. Malachi Brooks's fingers gripped the yoke. Knuckles' pale eyes locked on the instrument panel as numbers shifted faster than he liked. The airspeed needle flickered slightly. The autopilot was still trying to reassert itself as if the machine refused to surrender control to the boy who now held its reins. "It's trying to correct you," said Richard Hall, his voice tight as he watched from the captain's seat. "It's reading your manual input as a deviation." Malachi nodded without looking up. "I know. It's programmed to hold altitude, but I need it to let go. It's not used to someone else flying while it's alive." He reached across the panel, toggled the mode selector to CWS control wheel, steering, forcing the plane to recognize a hybrid command. The change was subtle, but enough to make the aircraft respond to him rather than resist. He exhaled softly. "There," he said. "Now it listens." Clarice watched from behind, arms crossed tightly, unable to hide her worry. "How long can you keep it steady?" she asked. "As long as it needs me to," Malachi said. His tone was too calm for a child. The reality of it hit her again. He wasn't just repeating his father's lessons anymore. He was flying a jet. Richard kept calling out readings. "Altitude 23,000, airspeed 425, descent stable?" "Good," Malachi said. "We'll hold at 20 for now. I want visual confirmation of Eugene before we go any lower." Outside, the sunlight had dimmed completely, replaced by the muted reflection of the cloud cover. Then faintly, the first flashes of lightning began to pulse in the distance, flickering through the layered haze. Clarice noticed it first. "Is that lightning?" Malachi followed her gaze and frowned. The storm cell ahead was faint, but growing a dark wall of turbulence gathering along their projected path. "That wasn't in the flight plan," Richard muttered. "Storm systems move fast over the Cascades," Malachi said quietly. "We'll have to go around it." He turned the yoke gently to the right, adjusting their heading 5 degrees west. The plane resisted at first, autopilot logic still fighting his deviation. Malachi increased his input, forcing the system to yield. "Come on," he whispered. "Work with me." The aircraft banked slowly, the engines groaning in protest as the turbulence began to nibble at the wings. The cabin lights flickered again. Back in the passenger cabin, the world had begun to tilt. The shift was gentle at first, but people noticed it. A murmur spread as the horizon line tilted against the windows. Marla steadied herself against a seat and tried to reassure them. "We're adjusting course slightly. Everything is fine." But fear doesn't listen to reason. A woman shouted, "Why is it turning? What's happening?" The baby in row 9 started crying again. The tension rippled through the cabin like a wave. The boy in the cockpit couldn't hear them, but he could feel them. He knew panic was spreading behind him, and the only thing that could stop it was control. Steady, confident control. Richard watched the weather data flicker across the screens. "We can't keep heading west much longer," he said. "We'll lose alignment with Eugene." Malachi nodded. "I just need a gap in the storm line, a corridor of clean air. If we hit that turbulence too hard, we could stall." He eased the throttle, slightly feeling the change in vibration through his hands. The yoke trembled like a heartbeat. His training, his father's relentless drills came rushing back. "Trim for balance. Don't fight what you can guide." He adjusted the elevator trim and stabilized their descent again. The aircraft leveled for a moment, the trembling easing. Clarice exhaled audibly. "You did it," she whispered. Malachi didn't answer. His eyes were still locked on the horizon. The storm wall loomed closer, glowing faintly from within, with veins of lightning. It looked alive. Richard's voice came low. "That's building faster than expected. We need to decide through it or around it," Malachi thought quickly. "Going through could destabilize the control systems. The interference might spike again. We'll go around." "That'll burn more fuel," Richard warned. "I know," Malachi replied, "but if we lose control, it won't matter how much fuel we have." He adjusted the course again, steering along the edge of the storm line. The turbulence hit them anyway, a sharp jolt that shook the entire fuselage. Clarice grabbed the back of the captain's chair to steady herself. Sparks of static flashed across the windshield. The lights dimmed, then returned. "Easy," Malachi said under his breath. "She's just talking to us." Richard checked the readings again. Altitude 19,000, airspeed 390, holding steady. "That's good," Malachi said. "We'll stay here until we clear the edge." The plane bounced again, a deep shudder rolling through the cabin. In the back, oxygen masks rattled slightly from their compartments, though none had fallen yet. The passengers screamed. Marla moved quickly down the aisle, voice raised, trying to calm them. Clarice turned toward Malachi, her voice shaking. "Can we climb above it?" "Too late," he said. "The storm's already over us." Another blast of turbulence hit stronger this time. The overhead compartments shuddered. A bag fell into the aisle. The plane dropped briefly before stabilizing again. "What was that?" Clarice gasped. "Wind shear," Malachi said. "The pressure difference between the layers. It's trying to pull us into the cell." He gripped the yoke harder, pushing the nose slightly down, counteracting the upward draft. The aircraft resisted, then obeyed. His muscles ached from the effort. Richard's knuckles were white as he clutched the console. "Altitude holding," he said quickly. 18.9. You're good." "Not yet," Malachi said. The lightning flashed again, closer now. Thunder cracked, muffled through the fuselage, but still enough to make Clarice flinch. The turbulence began to fade as suddenly as it had arrived. The storm wall passed to their left, a swirling pillar of silver and black. Beyond it, a narrow corridor of calm air opened like a path between worlds. Malachi guided the plane into it, adjusting the throttle for smoother airflow. "We're clear," he said finally. "Voice steady again." Clarice slumped against the doorway, trembling with relief. "How did you know what to do?" she whispered. "My father used to make me practice crosswind landings in storm conditions," Malachi said. "He said the sky doesn't care how scared you are, it only respects what you know." Richard checked the instruments again. Altitude steady at 18,000. Airspeed 375. "We're tracking north again," good Malachi said. Now we look for Eugene. He peered through the windshield, scanning the darkened landscape below. The clouds began to break apart, revealing faint glimmers of light. Far beneath them, the scattered dots of towns and highways glowing through the mist. He pointed. There. That's Interstate 5. If we follow that north, it leads straight to Eugene. Richard nodded. You're right. That's our corridor. Clarice finally smiled, the first real smile since the crisis began. You're incredible, she said softly. Malachi didn't smile back. His hand stayed on the controls, eyes unblinking. I'm just doing what I was taught, he said. We're not safe yet. Outside, the last glow of lightning faded behind them, and the sky returned to its dim, endless gray. The plane leveled again, steady and obedient now, as if it had accepted its new pilot at last. In the cabin behind them, people began to quiet, sensing the calm. Some whispered prayers of thanks. Others just wept quietly, not knowing that it was the hands of a 12-year-old boy guiding them home. The cabin filled with a collective gasp as passengers pressed against windows, whispering, crying, praying. They were still in the air, still moving, but they could see the ground now. Hope had shape again. In the cockpit, Malachi Brooks exhaled quietly, his eyes fixed on the illuminated sprawl beneath them. That's Eugene, he said. Richard Hall leaned forward, peering through the windshield. You sure positive, Malachi said? 2 intersecting runways northwest side of the city. That's Malin Sweetfield. The boy's tone carried no uncertainty. It was command in the purest form, something that made Clarice's stomach twist with a strange mix of fear and admiration. She glanced at the unconscious pilots, their bodies still unmoving in their seats, oxygen masks in place, heartbeats steady but shallow. You're going to have to land this thing, she said softly, as if saying it aloud would make it real. Yes, ma'am, Malachi replied. We don't have another option. Down on the ground, air traffic control at Eugene Tower had already detected a ghost on their radar screens, a Boeing 737 matching the path of Flight 447, but broadcasting no signal, no transponder, no radio response. That can't be right, said the controller, a woman named Linda Reeves, as she adjusted her headset. It's squawking blank. No mode C, no communication, what the hell? Her partner Jeff Crane leaned over her shoulder. Check frequency again. She did. Nothing but static. Try emergency frequency. Still nothing. Jeff frowned. If that's Flight 447, it's been missing for over 40 minutes. Linda stared at the screen. Then, who's flying it? They sent multiple hails, each one unanswered as the radar dot continued its descent, perfectly steady, perfectly aligned with the airport approach path. It's flying like a computer, Jeff muttered. Autopilot, maybe. But then the vector shifted slightly, a correction too human, too intentional. No, Linda said slowly. Someone's flying that plane. Up above, Malachi made that exact correction, adjusting the heading to align with the approach pattern. Altitude 16,000, Richard called out. Descent steady. Good, Malachi said. We'll need to start configuring for landing soon. Speed to 250. He adjusted the throttle carefully, feeling the engine response through the yoke. The plane obeyed smoothly at first, then, without warning, a sharp beep echoed through the cockpit. A red indicator flashed to life on the overhead panel. Fuel imbalance, Richard said quickly, scanning the display. Right tank down by 200 kilograms. Malachi frowned. That can't be right. The fuel system was stable earlier. Another beep followed. The imbalance grew. It's draining unevenly, Malachi said. The right engine's pulling more flow. If it keeps up, we'll lose symmetry. Clarice looked confused. What does that mean? It means one side will get lighter than the other, Richard explained. The plane will want to roll that direction. If it's too severe, we could lose control or an engine. Malachi tightened his grip on the yoke. We can balance it manually. We'll cross-feed fuel from the left tank to even it out. His voice remained steady, but the flicker in his eyes betrayed the weight of what he was doing. He reached overhead, toggling the cross-feed valve switch. The system responded with a low hum. The red light faded slightly, but didn't vanish. It's stabilizing, he said. Richard nodded, still watching the gauges. That'll buy us time. Outside, the clouds thinned further, revealing the flat stretch of land where the airport waited like a quiet promise. The runways glimmered faintly under floodlights. Clarice leaned toward the window. "I can see it," she whispered. Malachi glanced briefly. "Good. Visual confirmation helps. Now we need to slow her down." He eased back on the throttle, lowering airspeed gradually. The engine's pitch deepened into a softer drone. "Flaps 1?" he said. Richard hesitated. "Are you sure you want to start configuration this early?" "I need drag," Malachi replied. "We're too high for final descent. Flaps will help reduce speed before approach." Richard reached for the lever deploying the first stage. The plane shuddered slightly, the familiar vibration of drag beginning to build. Back in the cabin, the descent felt more pronounced now. Some passengers clutched their armrests as the nose angled downward. Marla moved through the aisle, repeating, "Everything is okay. We're approaching for landing." The words sounded rehearsed, brittle, but they were all anyone had left. The baby in row 9 finally stopped crying, exhausted. The businessman who had once dismissed the boy in 14A now sat silently gripping his seatbelt, whispering prayers. In the cockpit, the final phase of decision-making began. "We're passing 12,000, Richard said. "Speed 220, good," Malachi said. "Gear down in 3 minutes." He looked ahead. The airport lights grew brighter now, a straight white line cutting through the darkness. But between them and the runway was a thin layer of haze ground fog rolling in from the Willamette Valley, low and dense. "Visibility's dropping," he said quietly. Richard checked the data. "You're right. Ground fog may be 600 feet thick. We'll have to rely on the glide slope for a while," Malachi said. "As soon as we break through the fog, we'll have visual contact." Clarice gripped the doorframe tightly. "And if we don't," Malachi's eyes stayed forward. "Then we trust what we can see on the instruments." Down below at Eugene Tower, Linda Reeves was already coordinating emergency crews. Runway 16, L clear. All lights to max intensity. Dispatch ambulances and fire trucks to stand by. Jeff watched the radar. "They're lining up perfectly," he said. "Whoever's in that cockpit knows what they're doing." Linda exhaled. "Let's hope they can finish what they started." Back in the cockpit, Malachi's voice cut through the tension. "Gear down," he commanded. Richard pulled the lever. The heavy mechanical whir filled the cabin as the landing gear extended, locking into place. 3 green, Richard confirmed. "All down and locked. Flaps 2, Malachi said. The plane slowed further. The airport lights were now directly ahead, bright against the darkness. "Altitude 5,000. Airspeed 180, Richard read aloud. "Perfect," Malachi replied. "Lining up for approach." The boy's focus was absolute, now his breathing, even his mind, a precise map of procedures. His father's words echoed again. "The last 1,000 feet decide everything. The plane will tell you what it wants, listen." Clarice glanced at the unconscious pilots one last time. She thought about how just hours ago she'd crouched beside a smiling kid coloring cartoons, never imagining that same child would now hold her life in his trembling hands. She whispered under her breath, "Please let him do this." As they descended through 3,000 feet, the fog thickened, swallowing the world outside. The windshield turned into a gray blur. Only the instruments spoke now. "On glide path," Richard said. "Maintain descent rate 700 feet per minute." Holding Malachi replied, adjusting the throttle delicately. The plane vibrated, a low rumble building beneath their feet. The red light flickered again on the fuel panel. "The imbalance is back," Richard said sharply. "We're down to 10% difference. Right tank's running lean." Malachi's mind raced. "We'll keep it balanced with yaw trim. We're too close to reconfigure the system." He pressed the left rudder pedal, slightly countering the roll. The wings leveled. "Still stable," he said. A long, trembling silence filled the aircraft. Then, as if released from a spell, the cabin erupted in cheers and sobs. The woman who had prayed out loud was crying uncontrollably. The businessman in 17A pressed his hands over his face. A child shouted that they were alive. Clarice Henson stood frozen in the cockpit doorway, her breath catching between disbelief and awe. She turned toward the boy in the right-hand seat. Malachi Brooks still had his small hands on the yoke, his head tilted forward, his breathing ragged. His brown skin glistened with sweat, his shoulders shaking slightly as adrenaline began to drain from his body. The engines wound down, humming into quiet. For a second, no one moved. No one spoke. It was only then that Captain Morrison stirred. A faint groan escaped from the captain's seat. Clarice blinked, hardly believing her ears. She stepped forward quickly. "Captain," she said. His eyelids fluttered. The man's hand twitched on the throttle. Oxygen hissed softly from the mask that still covered his face. "Captain Morrison," Clarice said again, louder this time. His head turned slightly toward the sound of her voice. He blinked at the panels, then at the boy beside him. His lips moved soundlessly before a whisper escaped. "What happened?" Clarice's voice cracked. "You passed out, sir. Both of you did." Morrison's eyes widened slightly, still fogged by the lingering effects of hypoxia and shock. "The plane," he murmured. "Who landed it?" He looked around, his gaze falling on the small figure in the co-pilot's chair. Malachi didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his eyes half closed. Clarice swallowed hard. "He did." The captain blinked again, confusion breaking into disbelief. "The boy," he whispered. "Yes, sir," Clarice said softly. "The boy." Outside, emergency vehicles were already surrounding the plane. Red and white lights flashed across the windows, throwing long shadows inside the cabin. Fire crews moved in precise formation, checking the undercarriage, the engines, the landing gear. The radio chatter between tower and responders crackled with fragments of disbelief. Confirmed. Flight 447 down on 16 LZ. Gear intact. No injuries reported. Both pilots unresponsive. Weight correction, one's conscious. Repeat, one's conscious. Inside the cockpit, Captain Morrison was fighting to sit up. "First Officer Tran," he asked. Clarice moved to check. The young co-pilot remained slumped against her harness, still unconscious but breathing steadily. "She's alive," Clarice said. "Medical's on the way." Morrison nodded weakly, then turned back toward Malachi. "Son," he said hoarsely. Did you really fly her down?" Malachi blinked, lifting his head slightly. His voice was barely audible. "Yes, sir. My father taught me." Morrison's eyes filled with something unspoken, shame, gratitude, astonishment all at once. He wanted to speak, but his throat failed him. Clarice knelt beside Malachi, touching his arm gently. "You can let go now," she said softly. The boy's fingers tightened once more around the yoke before releasing it. His shoulders slumped. The control column, still warm from his grip, stood like a monument between him and the captain. "You did it, sweetheart," Clarice whispered. "You brought us home." Malachi turned toward her, a faint smile trembling on his lips. "Are we really down?" "We're down," she said. "You did it." But the relief was too heavy for his small frame to carry. As the first responders banged on the cockpit door, calling through the metal, Malachi's vision blurred. The flashing lights outside turned to smears of color. The next thing he knew, everything went black. The emergency crew forced the door open seconds later. They found Clarice holding the boy upright, her uniform streaked with sweat and soot, her eyes wet with tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. "He's fainted," she said quickly. "He's just a kid." The paramedics moved swiftly, one checking his pulse, another preparing oxygen. "Pulse strong," one said. "He's exhausted." The captain tried to speak, but the words dissolved into a rasp. They helped him onto a stretcher alongside the unconscious co-pilot. As the rescuers lifted Malachi out of the chair, his small hand brushed against the throttle lever, the same control his father had once called the heartbeat of the sky. In the cabin, the passengers erupted again when they saw the boy carried down the aisle. Some stood and applauded. Others reached out to touch his shoulder as he passed. The woman from row 17 clasped her hands to her mouth, whispering, "It was him. The boy flew us home." The older man beside her nodded, tears in his eyes. "He's the reason we're alive." Outside the aircraft, the air smelled of jet fuel and damp tarmac. The night had turned calm again, the storm long gone. As the paramedics carried Malachi down the stairway, the crowd of responders and officials gathered near the base. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions, their voices cutting through the noise. Who landed the plane? Was it true a child was flying? Clarice shielded her eyes from the lights, her voice steady but tired. "He's just a passenger," she said quietly. "But tonight he was our pilot." Inside the terminal airport, officials scrambled to make sense of the impossible. Linda Reeves from Tower Control stood near the glass observation window, watching the emergency crews swarm around the plane. "I still can't believe it," she murmured. "We lost all contact. I thought they were gone." Her partner, Jeff, exhaled. "If I hadn't seen that final vector correction myself, I'd think it was autopilot. But that wasn't a computer move. That was human." Linda nodded slowly. A 12-year-old boy just did what trained pilots spend decades mastering. She pressed a trembling hand against her mouth. God bless that kid. Back on the tarmac, Malachi stirred as the oxygen mask was pressed to his face. The paramedic smiled gently. "Easy now, champ. You did good. Real good." The boy blinked up at him, his voice weak. "Everyone's safe. Every single one of them," the man said. "You saved them all." Malachi's lips moved in a faint smile before his eyes closed again. The paramedics carried him to the waiting ambulance, the night air cool against his skin. Clarice followed close behind, her heart still hammering. The adrenaline had begun to fade, leaving behind an ache so deep it felt like gravity itself. Captain Morrison was wheeled past her, half-conscious but lucid enough to speak. "Henson," he croaked. She leaned close. "Yes, sir." That boy, Morrison said. "Make sure they take care of him. He deserves more than a medal." Clarice nodded. "I will, sir." As the captain was lifted into another ambulance, his gaze drifted toward the dark silhouette of the 737. "She shouldn't have survived that descent," he whispered. But she did. The remaining passengers disembarked under the supervision of ground crews, blinking in the floodlights. Some carried their bags. Others left everything behind, too shaken to care. A few stopped to look at the boy being loaded into the ambulance. The woman who had told him to sit down earlier clasped her hands together and whispered, "I'm sorry." When the ambulance doors closed, Clarice stood still for a long moment, staring at the red taillights disappearing into the dark. Around her, the chaos of the runway continued, voices on radios, engines idling, reporters pushing against barriers, but none of it touched her. The sound of the crowd faded into a dull hum. All she could hear was the echo of the boy's voice from earlier. "We're not safe yet." She turned back towards the aircraft one last time. Its silver body gleamed under the floodlights, streaked with the dirt and rain from the storm they had survived. She walked toward it, slowly touching the cold metal of the fuselage with her fingertips. "You brought us home?" she whispered, though she didn't know whether she was speaking to the plane or the boy who had flown it. For a brief, perfect moment, everything was still again, the sky, the ground, the world. Clarice Henson sat by the window, her uniform jacket folded over her lap, staring at the headlines flickering across the television mounted on the wall. Every station carried the same story. 12-year-old Boylan's commercial jet after pilot's collapse. The footage replayed endlessly emergency vehicles surrounding the Boeing passengers, hugging each other on the tarmac, the ambulance door closing as cameras flashed. Reporters spoke in reverent tones, their disbelief replaced by awe. Clarice turned down the volume, her eyes drifting toward the boy who had made it all possible. She still couldn't reconcile the image in her mind, the small kid who'd asked politely for apple juice hours earlier, with the calm, decisive voice that had guided them through storm and silence. He looked younger now, asleep and motionless, the gravity of what he'd done erased by the innocence of his rest. Down the hall, Captain Morrison leaned against his crutches, a bandage around his head, arguing gently with the attending physician. "He should be under observation, not interrogation," the captain said firmly. The doctor nodded. "The FAA needs statements, Captain. They're waiting outside." Morrison exhaled, rubbing his temples. Then they can wait another hour. The boy needs rest. Behind him, First Officer Tran sat in a wheelchair, pale but recovering. Her eyes were distant, replaying fragments she could barely recall. "I heard his voice," she said softly. "Right before I blacked out. I thought I imagined it. But it was real, wasn't it?" Morrison nodded. "It was as real as it gets. He flew us home." He glanced toward the door leading to Malachi's room. "I owe that kid my life." By mid-morning, the hospital parking lot had filled with news vans, their satellite dishes angled toward the sky. Reporters shouted questions at anyone in uniform. Who taught him to fly? How old is he? Will he receive a commendation? None of them knew his name at first, just the image brown-skinned small calm beyond comprehension. The boy pilot, one network called him. The miracle child said another. Within hours, the story had crossed the country, then the ocean. In Seattle, a news anchor whispered through tears. "If you ever doubted courage, look at this boy." Inside the room, Clarice watched as a nurse adjusted the IV. "He's been asleep almost 10 hours, the nurse said quietly. "He'll wake soon." Clarice nodded. "Good. There's someone he needs to see." She hadn't told Malachi yet, but his parents had been located and were en route, his mother from Portland, his father from a rehabilitation center 2 towns over. The moment she got confirmation, she'd sat down and cried for the first time since the landing. There was something cosmic about it, as if fate had waited until the skies calmed to bring the family together again. A soft sound broke her thoughts. A sigh. Clarice looked up. Malachi's fingers twitched. His eyelids fluttered. Then slowly he opened his eyes. For a second, confusion crossed his face, then recognition. The ceiling light, the antiseptic air, the rhythmic beep of the monitor. It all made sense too quickly for someone who'd just survived the unthinkable. "Where am I?" he whispered. Clarice stood immediately, smiling through the exhaustion. "You're safe, sweetheart. You're in Eugene Hospital." He blinked. "Did we land?" "We did," she said gently. "You landed us." His brow furrowed. "The passengers? The pilots? Everyone's alive," Clarice said. "You saved them all." He exhaled softly, sinking back against the pillow. "Good," he murmured. Then, after a pause, he added, "My dad was right." Clarice frowned. About what Malachi's eyes drifted toward the window, where the morning light streamed through pale blue curtains. He said the sky only listens to people who respect it. His voice was faint, like an echo from somewhere higher. Clarice felt her throat tighten. "You did more than respect it," she said quietly. "You commanded it." He smiled weakly. "I didn't command it. I just listened." Outside, the hallway filled with footsteps. The door opened, and a woman's voice broke through, trembling but full of love. "Malachi." His mother, dressed in travel-wrinkled clothes, rushed forward, her eyes red from crying. She dropped her bag and fell to her knees beside the bed, cradling his face. "Oh, baby, thank God." He smiled faintly, reaching for her hand. "Hi, Mom." She was crying too hard to speak. Behind her, a wheelchair rolled in. His father, Vernon Brooks, older now, thinner but unmistakably strong in presence, wheeled himself closer, his hands shaking as he gripped the rims. "Son," he whispered, his voice breaking. Malachi's eyes widened. Dad Vernon nodded, tears gathering in his eyes. "They told me what you did. You flew that plane." Malachi swallowed hard. "You taught me how." Vernon reached for his hand. "I taught you theory. You did the impossible." Clarice turned away, giving them privacy, but she could still hear their voices, soft, breaking, full of everything words could never hold. Vernon's hand tightened around his son's. "I always told you, knowledge is power," he said, "but I never knew it would save so many." Malachi looked up at him, eyes shimmering. "I remembered every word you said, every warning, every drill." His father smiled through tears. "I was too hard on you sometimes. I just wanted you to be ready." "You were right," Malachi whispered. "You said the world doesn't wait for grown-ups to fix it." His mother pressed her lips to his forehead. "No one will ever doubt that again." By noon, the hospital corridor was lined with officials, FAA representatives, airline executives, local police, even a mayor's aide clutching a press release. Captain Morrison had to step in front of them. "He's a child," he said sternly. You can talk to him when he's ready, not before." They reluctantly agreed. The boy slept again for another hour, holding his father's hand even in dreams. When he woke the second time, it was to see a crowd gathered outside his door. Cameras waited. Reporters jostled. Clarice stepped inside, lowering her voice. "They want a statement about what he asked, about how you did it." Malachi looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "Can I just tell them the truth?" Inside the hospital, Malachi Brooks sat by the window of his recovery room, his father's wheelchair beside him. They watched together as another passenger jet climbed into the Sky Engine's roaring contrails cutting across the blue like white scars. "It's strange," Malachi murmured, seeing one go up and knowing exactly what it feels like from the front. Vernon Brooks smiled faintly, his hands folded in his lap. "You earned that view," he said softly. "You understand what it takes to keep something that heavy flying straight?" Malachi looked at him, then shook his head slowly. "I didn't keep it flying, Dad. The plane wanted to live, I just didn't let it forget." His father chuckled weakly, the sound full of pride and pain all at once. "You sound like me 20 years ago." "I sound like you today," Malachi replied, and they both laughed quietly, their shared silence saying more than words could. By noon, representatives from the FAA and the airline arrived with photographers' medals and scripted speeches. They filled the hallway with stiff suits and official expressions, speaking in the polite, sanitized language of ceremony. Mr. Brooks, the regional director, said, shaking his father's hand first, and young man Malachi, correct, "We're here on behalf of the Federal Aviation Administration to commend your extraordinary actions in saving Flight 447 and all 162 lives on board. You exhibited calm, technical proficiency and courage that far exceed your years." He gestured to an aide who stepped forward holding a small velvet case. Inside was a gold pin shaped like wings and a certificate bearing his name in bold print. "We'd like to grant you honorary pilot certification," the director said. "You're the youngest recipient in our history." Cameras flashed. Everyone in the room waited for the boy to smile, but Malachi didn't reach for the medal. His gaze dropped to the case, then back to the man holding it. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly, "but I can't take it." The director blinked, caught off guard. "You've earned this recognition. It's not about status, it's about honoring your bravery." Malachi shook his head. "It's not mine," he said simply. "It belongs to my dad." The room fell silent. Vernon looked stunned. "Son," he began, but Malachi interrupted gently. "You taught me everything I needed to know. You gave me the tools. I just used them when the Sky asked me to. If there's an award, it's yours." The director looked uncomfortable, unsure how to proceed. "Perhaps you both deserve it," he said, finally setting the medal on the table between them. But Malachi didn't touch it. He looked out the window again at the open blue sky. "My dad already gave me wings," he said softly. "They just don't shine like that." When the officials left, Clarice entered quietly, carrying a folded newspaper. "You made the front page again," she said, placing it beside his bed. The headline read, "The Boy Who Listened to the Sky." Underneath was a photo of Malachi standing beside his father's wheelchair, holding nothing but the stuffed rabbit he'd carried on the flight. "Everyone keeps asking what you'll do next," Clarice said, sitting down. "You could have a scholarship waiting by next week. Aviation schools, NASA, even the Air Force called." Malachi smiled faintly. "I don't know if I want to fly anymore." Clarice tilted her head. "You don't?" He shook his head. "When I was up there, it didn't feel like a dream. It felt like a test. I don't need to keep proving it." Clarice nodded slowly. "Then what will you do?" Malachi thought for a moment. "Something quieter. Maybe teach. Maybe build things that help people. My dad says flying isn't about planes, it's about understanding motion and control. Maybe I can teach others how to keep steady when everything's falling." She smiled at that. "That sounds like a good kind of flying, too." As the afternoon light faded, passengers from Flight 447 began visiting the hospital one by one. They brought cards, flowers, thank you notes written in trembling hands. A grandmother from Seat 22C hugged him, whispering, You gave me back my family." A college student pressed a silver cross into his hand. "You were the calm in our storm," she said. Even the businessman from 17A appeared, his tie gone, his eyes swollen from crying. He knelt awkwardly beside the bed. "I told you to sit down," he said hoarsely. "I've never been more wrong in my life." Malachi smiled faintly. "It's okay," he said. "You didn't know I could stand up." The man laughed through tears, shaking his head. "Kid, you stood up for all of us." Outside, the reporters were still waiting, but inside that quiet hospital room, something gentler took root. Vernon spoke softly to his son as they watched the sun sink below the horizon. "When I had my stroke," he said, "I thought I'd lost everything, the sky, my job, my strength. But when you landed that plane, I realized I hadn't lost anything at all. I just passed it on." Malachi looked at him with a calm that belonged to both boy and man. "You didn't lose the sky, Dad," he said. "You shared it." Vernon reached out and placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his grip firm but tender. "Promise me something," he said. "Promise me that whatever you do next, you'll never forget how small we are compared to the world above us." "I promise," Malachi said. "But I'll also remember that even the smallest hands can hold it steady." That night, long after the press had gone and the city quieted, Malachi asked to step outside. Clarice helped wheel his father beside him as they stood at the hospital courtyard, looking up at the same sky that had once tried to break them. The stars shimmered faintly distant, yet familiar. A plane passed overhead, its lights blinking softly, a reminder that the world kept moving, that flights still rose and landed because someone always trusted the unseen. "You think they're scared up there?" Malachi asked. His father shook his head. "No. They're where they belong." Malachi nodded. "So were we." Clarice looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're never going to forget that day, are you?" He smiled. "I don't think the sky will let me." Weeks later, when the airline officially retired the flight number out of respect, a small plaque was mounted at the Eugene terminal wall. It read, "In honor of the passengers and crew of Flight 447 and to Malachi Brooks, who reminded us that courage can have the voice of a child." Travelers passing by would pause to read it, some wiping tears, others whispering the name as if it belonged to someone they'd always known. The plane itself was repaired and placed back in service months later, renamed the Brooks Star. On its maiden flight, Captain Morrison himself piloted the route. Before takeoff, he placed a small note inside the cockpit taped above the controls where only pilots would see it. It read, "If the sky ever forgets who you are, listen harder. It remembers you better than you think." Years would pass before Malachi returned to flying, not as a pilot but as an engineer, designing safer cockpits, ones that could listen, respond, and protect. He never took another medal, never sought the spotlight, but every time he walked past an airport, he looked up and whispered, still listening. Somewhere high above a contrail stretched across the sky like a quiet signature. The end. If this story moved, you make sure to like and subscribe for more real emotional stories that stay with you. Tell us what you thought about the ending. Did Malachi make the right choice? And let us know where you're watching from in the comments below.